Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Mercer. I'm 33 years old. My mother kept me sick for 19 years, spoke for me at every appointment, locked my medication in a kitchen cabinet I was never allowed to open, and built my whole life around the idea that I was too fragile to survive on my own. And then one Tuesday morning, a new doctor looked at my blood work, frowned, and asked why none of it matched the diagnosis that had controlled my entire childhood. My mother answered before I could. She always did. "She gets confused when she's overwhelmed," she said, resting one hand on my arm like she was comforting me instead of controlling the room. "I can explain everything." I was 33 years old. I had a driver's license, a library card, a lease in my own name, and a habit of apologizing before I finished sentences. But the moment I sat on an exam table beside my mother, I turned back into the girl she'd trained me to be. Quiet, grateful, uncertain, and slightly ashamed of having a body that was always supposedly one bad day away from collapse. The exam room smelled like alcohol wipes and paper sheets. My mother sat closest to the doctor's desk. Not by accident. She always positioned herself where she could intercept the conversation before it reached me cleanly. She had done that my whole life. When I was 7, she told teachers I had a rare condition that made exertion dangerous. When I was 9, she stopped letting me go to birthday parties because one stomach bug could send her to the hospital. When I was 12, she pulled me out of a school field trip and cried in the parking lot afterward, saying, "You have no idea how hard it is watching your child live like this." Live like what? I used to wonder. I was tired a lot, nervous, small for my age, sometimes dizzy. But I had no language for what was normal because my mother had built the vocabulary of my body before I was old enough to question it. Fragile, complicated, delicate, at risk. Special case. Not like other girls. Other girls played soccer. I stayed inside. Other girls went to sleepovers. I went to specialists. Other girls learned to trust themselves. I learned to wait for my mother's face before deciding how scared I should be. She kept my medicine in a locked cabinet above the refrigerator. Small orange bottles, white bottles, blister packs, things she shook into her palm and handed me with juice while reminding me how lucky I was to have someone watching me so carefully. If I asked what they were for, she always had an answer. Ready, patient, and wounded at the same time. For your inflammation. For your episodes. For the symptoms you forget because I'm the one who has to keep track. I believed her because children believe the person who sounds the calmest in the room. And my mother was always calm when other people were watching. Gentle, tireless, self-sacrificing. The kind of woman neighbors called an angel because they never saw what happened after the casseroles stopped coming. At home, illness was the center of our lives and also the leash around mine. I was not allowed to shower with the door locked. I was not allowed to walk to the corner store alone. I was not allowed to keep my own pills, refill my own prescriptions, or describe my own symptoms without being corrected. If I said I felt fine, my mother would laugh softly and say, "You always say that right before a flare." If I said I felt bad, she would sigh like vindication had arrived right on time. My father never challenged her. He worked long hours, came home tired, kissed my forehead, and told me to listen to Mom because she knows your case better than anybody. When he died when I was 15, the house got quieter and her control got cleaner. There was no second adult left to interrupt the story. Just me and the woman who knew exactly how to make dependence sound like love. By 19, I had never had a job, never spent a night away from home alone, and never once picked up a prescription myself. By 22, my mother was telling relatives I probably would not marry because a man wouldn't understand the level of care she needs. By 27, even I had started saying it about myself. That is the ugliest part of being controlled for so long. Eventually, the cage starts using your own voice. The only reason I ended up with Dr. Simon Keller at all was that my mother's longtime physician retired. She complained about it for weeks, said new doctors were reckless, said continuity mattered with complex patients, said she would need to be extra vigilant because people who didn't know my history might miss something dangerous. So there we were, her handbag on her lap. my file open on the screen. His eyes moving from the lab results to me, then back to the screen again. He asked me, not her, "Julia, how long have you been taking these medications?" I opened my mouth. My mother answered, "Since childhood, they've kept her stable." He didn't nod. That was the first strange thing. Most doctors nodded at my mother. They respected the binders, the dates, the memorized timelines. They liked mothers who came prepared. But Dr. Keller just kept reading, his forehead tightening slightly as he scrolled. Then he looked at me and said very quietly, "And who explained your diagnosis to you?" Before I could speak, my mother stood up. "We're done for today," she said with a bright little smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This has clearly been too much." But Dr. Keller didn't stand. He reached for the old records request already sitting in the chart, clicked twice, and said, "No, Mrs. Mercer. I think we're just getting to the beginning. Julia, I want to open your childhood file." My mother tried to end the appointment by standing up. That had always worked before. In every office I had ever sat in, the second she said, "She's tired," or "That's enough for today," or "You don't understand her history," the room folded around her authority like paper around a blade. Doctors softened, nurses nodded, receptionists printed follow-up slips, and I went home with another adjusted dose, another warning, another year of my life explained back to me in my mother's voice. Dr. Keller didn't move. He clicked once, then twice, and turned the monitor slightly so I could see it too. "I requested the archived pediatric records from your old practice before you arrived," he said. "They were scanned in this morning." My mother went pale. Not dramatically, just enough. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was that she stopped touching me. For 19 years, she had always kept a hand on my shoulder, my arm, my wrist, the back of my chair, comforting in public, containing in practice. The moment Dr. Keller mentioned the childhood file, she took her hand away like skin itself had become inconvenient. "I don't see why that would be relevant," she said. He kept his eyes on the screen. "Because your current chart describes a long-term inflammatory condition with episodic instability beginning in early childhood. But the lab pattern in front of me doesn't support that. So I'd like to know when the diagnosis was first established, by whom, and on what findings." My mother crossed her arms. "You're questioning 20 years of care?" "No," he said calmly. "I'm questioning the record." That sentence changed something in me, not because it solved anything, because for the first time in my life, someone was separating me from the story about me. I slid off the exam table and moved closer to the desk before my mother could step between us again. Dr. Keller opened the earliest record. 8 years old, clinic note, weight low, mild fatigue, no acute distress. Then another, 9 years old, normal inflammatory markers, no sustained abnormal findings. Then another, 10 years old, recommendation observe, no chronic medication indicated at this time. I stared at the screen. "Wait," I said. My own voice sounded strange to me, too flat, too careful. "That can't be right." My mother's head snapped toward me. "Julia." "No," Dr. Keller said quietly. "Let her ask." I swallowed. I started taking medication before that. He clicked again. A scanned specialist note opened, older than the others, partially faded at the edges. Assessment. Symptoms nonspecific. Further monitoring needed. Avoid unnecessary long-term steroid exposure pending confirmation. I looked at him, then at my mother, then back at the screen. Steroid exposure. One of the pill bottles from the locked cabinet flashed in my mind so clearly it made me cold. White label. Bitter taste. The ones that made my hands shake and my face swell when I was a teenager, and my mother always said, "That means it's working." Dr. Keller printed 3 pages and laid them on the desk, one by one. "This record does not show a confirmed diagnosis at the age your current chart claims," he said. "In fact, it shows repeated uncertainty." My mother laughed then. A terrible sound. Thin, offended, desperate. You're reading old files out of context. He turned to her for the first time. Then help me with the context. She drew herself up. Julia was a very sick child. What made her sick? Everything. Stress, food, weather, school. She would crash all the time. He nodded once. Was she hospitalized? Not often. Abnormal imaging? Not that I recall. Positive markers. She's always been complicated. He let that sit in the room until it died on its own. Then he asked the question that broke the afternoon open. Mrs. Mercer, who actually prescribed the long-term medication regimen she's currently on? She answered too fast. Her old specialist. He clicked again, scanned down the record, and frowned. This specialist retired when Julia was 14. My mother said nothing. He kept going. These refill authorizations after that came from your primary physician's office, mostly through phone renewals, and the note language suggests they were continued based on history provided by the parent. Parent. Singular. Not patient. I sat down hard in the chair beside the desk. My mother stepped toward me then, reaching for my wrist again. Sweetheart, don't let him confuse you. You know your body. I pulled my hand away. That had never happened before, not once. And the look on her face, small, startled, almost frightened, did more to wake me up than the records did. Because sick girls are allowed to cry. Fragile girls are allowed to tremble. But girls who pull their hands back from their mothers in a doctor's office? Those girls are becoming witnesses. Dr. Keller printed one more page and slid it in front of me. At the bottom was a line I read 3 times before I understood it. Parent reports patient becomes distressed when not medicated. Clinical necessity remains unclear. Clinical necessity remains unclear. I whispered it out loud. My mother said, Julia, stop. I looked at her. For 19 years, she had built my life out of lowered voices, locked cabinets, careful interruptions, and the constant suggestion that without her I might not survive something invisible. And now, in a bright exam room with bad art on the wall and a new doctor printing old truths onto cheap paper, I saw the first crack in the whole structure. It was not just that I had been sick, it was that she had needed me to stay that way. Dr. Keller folded his hands and said very gently, Julia, before we do anything else, I need to ask you something without your mother answering. My mother opened her mouth. He lifted one finger, and for the first time in my life, someone made her be quiet. Then he looked at me and asked, Has anyone ever let you manage your own medication? No, I said. The word came out before I had time to soften it. Dr. Keller didn't react, but I saw something settle in his face. Not surprise, confirmation. Like he had been building a structure in his head since I walked in, and that one answer slid the last beam into place. No one ever let me manage it, I said again, steadier now. My mother kept everything in a locked cabinet. She handed me what I took. My mother took one sharp step toward us. Because you could never keep track of it yourself. I looked at her. That's what you always said. She folded her arms tighter. Because it was true. Dr. Keller turned to me. Do you know the names of everything you're currently taking? I opened my mouth, closed it. Then I looked at the medication list he had printed from my chart and felt something humiliating and hot crawl up my throat. I know some of them by color, I said. My mother made a little disgusted sound. Julia, no, he said, without raising his voice. That answer matters. And that was when I realized the room had split cleanly in two. On one side, my mother and the story. On the other, me and the facts I had never been allowed to hold long enough to examine. Dr. Keller lifted the list. These two, he said, pointing, should not have been continued this long without very specific ongoing evidence. This one can cause fatigue, dizziness, appetite changes, mood instability. This one can suppress normal responses and create the exact fragility it claims to treat if used improperly over time. I stared at the page, then at him. then back at the page. You mean they can make someone look sicker? He did not hesitate. Yes. My mother laughed again, thin and sharp. This is absurd. Dr. Keller ignored her. He clicked back into the childhood file, opened a timeline view, and turned the screen so I could see the dates in one long column. Ages, notes, refills, complaints, follow-ups. At 8, monitor. At 9, no confirmed condition. At 10, unclear clinical picture. At 11, parental concern escalating. At 12, trial medication. At 13, reported worsening fatigue. At 14, steroids continued despite uncertainty. At 15, dizziness, weight fluctuation, episodes of weakness. I could not stop looking at it. Because the timeline did something memory had never been allowed to do in my house. It lined things up, not feelings, sequence. When I was 11, I still climbed trees in secret behind the school gym. By 13, I was missing half days. By 15, I couldn't get through grocery stores without needing to sit down. I had always thought that meant the condition was progressing. But what if that was just the point when the treatment became the life? I put one hand over my mouth. My mother stepped toward me again. Softer now, the way she used to when I was little, and she wanted panic to feel like care. Sweetheart, don't let him do this. You know how hard we fought to get answers for you. We. That word almost broke me more than anything else, because she had always made the story plural whenever she needed me back inside it. Dr. Keller asked me gently, Julia, when you were a child, did you ever feel sick before the appointments, and then better when they were canceled? The room went still. I looked at him. Then somewhere behind my eyes, a memory opened. I was 9. Rainy morning. My backpack by the door. My mother telling me we were seeing the specialist instead of going to school. Me crying because I wanted to go on a class trip. Then the appointment got canceled, and by lunch I felt fine enough to ride my bike in circles in the driveway until she made me come inside. Another memory. 12 years old. A paper cup of apple juice. White powder not fully dissolved at the bottom. My mother saying, "Drink it all." 2 hours later, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. Then another. 14. A doctor asking her whether I was compliant. My mother saying, "Only when I supervise her closely." I whispered, "Oh my God." My mother's whole body changed, not dramatically, but enough. The softness vanished, the injured tenderness, the careful martyr act. For 1 second she looked furious, not at him, at me. "Julia," she said, low and clipped, "you are confused." That did it. Not the records, not the medications, that sentence. Because suddenly I could hear how many years of my life had been built inside those exact words. You are confused, you are tired, you are fragile, you are overwhelmed. Let me explain. Let me hold it. Let me speak. Let me keep the key. I looked at Dr. Keller and said, "Can she leave the room?" My mother actually stepped back like I had slapped her. "Excuse me?" I turned to her myself this time. "Can you leave?" She stared at me. Then she smiled. That smile, the one that always came right before punishment. "If I walk out," she said quietly, "you won't know what you're agreeing to." For one horrible second, the old fear surged anyway. The child fear, the cabinet key fear, the hospital band fear, the fear that without her I might collapse in some invisible way she had spent 2 decades teaching me to expect. Dr. Keller must have seen it happen in my face because his voice changed. "Julia," he said, "you are not required to stay inside a story that harms you just because someone has told it for a long time." I looked at him, then at my mother, then at the door. And when I spoke, my voice was shaking, but it was mine. "Leave." She did not move. So Dr. Keller stood, opened the exam room door, and called for a nurse. By the time the nurse reached us, my mother had finally understood something she had never had to understand before. The room was no longer hers. As she stepped into the hallway, she turned back toward me and said, in a voice so cold it didn't sound like motherhood at all. "If you do this, don't expect me to keep cleaning up after it." The door closed behind her. Dr. Keller sat back down. Then he opened one more note from my childhood file, frowned hard enough that my stomach dropped, and said, "Julia, there's something else in here. I need to know whether your mother ever gave you medication before it was formally prescribed." The note was from when I was 11. Dr. Keller read it once silently, then a second time slower, like he needed to make sure the words had not rearranged themselves into something less dangerous, while he blinked. Then he looked at me and asked, "Did your mother ever tell you she had already started treatment before certain appointments because she was worried doctors would move too slowly?" I stared at him. "Yes," I said. "She said sometimes she had to get ahead of my symptoms." My own voice sounded far away. The memory arrived whole. A paper cup of apple juice, white sediment at the bottom. My mother leaning against the counter saying, "Drink all of it. I already called the doctor." Me making a face because it tasted bitter. Then the long, heavy afternoon afterward, where my arms felt wrong and my legs shook under me like I had been unplugged from something. Dr. Keller turned the screen toward me. The note was brief, just one paragraph from the pediatric specialist. Parent reports having resumed prior medication at home before visit due to concern over increasing symptoms. Advised parent not to start or alter regimen without physician guidance. I looked up, then back at it, then up again. She wasn't supposed to do that? No. The word hit like cold water. He clicked again. Another note. Different year. Parent strongly insistent on maintaining steroid course despite limited objective findings. Then another. Child appears calmer, more energetic when medication paused due to pharmacy delay. Parent attributes improvement to reduced activity. I read that last sentence 3 times. Calmer, more energetic. When medication paused. I put both hands flat on the desk because suddenly the room felt like it had tilted slightly to the left. "She knew," I said. Dr. Keller chose his next words carefully. "I think there is evidence that your treatment may not have been medically justified in the way you were told. And I think there is evidence your mother may have influenced both the presentation and the continuation." Influenced. Such a clean word for what felt like a theft with no visible weapon. 19 years. 19 years of missed sleepovers, canceled jobs, supervised pills, frightened little glances at my own body, watching other women live ordinary lives like they had somehow been born with a sturdier species of blood. And somewhere inside all of that, my mother had been feeding me the very thing that helped keep the story alive. I laughed once, not because it was funny, because if I didn't, I was going to start screaming and never stop. Dr. Keller let me have the moment. Then he asked, "Do you live with her now?" "No." That made him nod. "Good. Because before we do anything else, I want to know whether she has access to your medications, your apartment, or your day-to-day care." I looked at the printed medication list in front of me. "She still picks up half my refills." He closed his eyes for 1 second. "Then that stops today." The certainty in his voice almost made me cry, not because I trusted him completely yet, because I realized how little certainty I had ever been offered that was meant to protect me instead of contain me. He stood, opened the door, and asked the nurse to bring in pharmacy, a patient advocate, and, after a tiny pause, a social worker. That pause mattered too, because the room had crossed into territory no one wanted to name lightly. The nurse returned first with my current medication summary and a paper bag. Dr. Keller told me to take every bottle I had at home and bring them in for review. He was going to change nothing abruptly, he said, but he was absolutely not letting me continue blindly. Then the patient advocate came in, sat beside me, and spoke to me like I was an adult whose answers belonged to her. That nearly undid me more than the records had. "What medications do you think you're on? Has anyone ever withheld them to control your schedule? Have you ever felt worse after something your mother gave you but couldn't identify? Has she ever spoken for you when you tried to answer first? By the third question, I was crying too hard to be embarrassed, so I told the truth. About the locked cabinet, about the juice, about the days I seemed to get sicker right before appointments and better when my mother was out of town. About the time I was 24 and stayed with a friend for 4 nights and felt so unexpectedly normal by the third day that I panicked and thought the real crash must be coming. It never did. When I came home, my mother told me that delayed flares were common and increased my meds for a week. The patient advocate wrote everything down, every word, not correcting me, not softening it, not translating it into kinder language than it deserved. When the social worker arrived, the room changed again. More serious, less medical, bigger somehow. She introduced herself as Dana and asked if I felt safe going home that evening if my mother knew where I lived. That question took me a second, because safety had never really belonged in the same sentence as my mother in my head. Not because I thought she would hit me, because harm had always come dressed as concern, in lowered voices and careful hands and little bottles with labels I wasn't allowed to hold too long. "I don't know," I said. Dana nodded like that answer made perfect sense. Then the nurse came back one more time and quietly told Dr. Keller, "She's causing a scene at the front desk." Of course she was. My mother had lost the room, so now she was trying to regain the building. Dr. Keller didn't even look surprised. He just stood, straightened the stack of printed pages, and said, "Julia, I need to tell you something before I step out there." I wiped my face. He met my eyes. "Based on what I've read and what you've described, I am very likely going to have to make a formal report." The words landed one at a time. Formal report? My mother? My whole life. He went on, "I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it because what happened to you may not just be mismanagement. It may meet the standard for something much more serious." At the front desk, I heard my mother raise her voice and say my name like she still owned it. Then Dr. Keller opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and said the sentence that finally made my hands stop shaking. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "you need to stop speaking for your daughter now." I heard my mother before I saw her, that bright, breaking voice she always used when she wanted strangers to mistake control for devotion. "She doesn't understand her own condition," she was saying at the front desk. "She gets confused and suggestible when people fill her head with ideas." For 19 years, that sentence would have ended the day. It would have brought me back under her hand, back into the car, back to the locked cabinet and the careful little paper cups and the life where every question about my own body had to pass through her first. Not this time. Dr. Keller stepped into the hallway and closed the exam room door behind him. I couldn't see his face from where I sat, but I could hear the way the air changed around him. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, calm and clear, "you need to stop speaking for your daughter now." My mother laughed, brittle and furious. "You have known her for 1 hour, and I have already seen enough." The hallway went quiet. Then she did what people like her always do when charm fails. She escalated. "You have no idea what I have sacrificed for her," she snapped. "Do you know how many nights I stayed awake? How many jobs I turned down? How many times I saved her from herself?" I sat there with the patient advocate and the social worker beside me and realized that was the whole engine of it. Not love, not medicine, ownership. She had built her identity around being the only person who could manage me. If I got well, what did that make her? Not a savior. Just a woman who had turned care into a cage and called it motherhood. Dr. Keller didn't raise his voice. "That may be how you understand it," he said. "But from this point on, your daughter's care belongs to her." There was a long pause. Then my mother said my name once, sharp and warning, like I was still 12 and standing too close to the cabinet. "Julia?" I stood up. My knees were shaking, but they held. When I opened the exam room door, she turned toward me with tears already ready. Her face was red, her mascara perfect in the way only practiced crying allows. "Tell him," she said. "Tell him I'm the only reason you're alive." The old panic rose for one terrible second. Then I looked at Dr. Keller, at Dana, at the nurse who had brought me tissues without making me feel childish, at the printed pages on the desk showing years of uncertainty buried under my mother's certainty, and I said the truest thing I had ever said in my life. "No, you're the reason I never got to find out who I was without being sick." The whole hallway heard it. My mother went white. Then security appeared at the far end, not running, not dramatic, just two quiet people in dark uniforms approaching, because hospitals understand escalation in the body before the room admits it. My mother looked around, finally seeing what I had seen 20 minutes earlier. The room was no longer hers. She left without touching me. That mattered too. After that, the day became practical in the most life-saving way. Dr. Keller had the pharmacy flag my chart, so no medication could be filled, changed, or collected through my mother again. Dana helped me call the building manager at my apartment and change the locks because my mother had always kept a just-in-case key. The patient advocate sat beside me while we listed every bottle I had at home, every refill routine, every doctor who had accepted my mother's version without asking me to finish a sentence. Later that afternoon, I brought in a grocery bag full of pill bottles from my kitchen. Dr. Keller lined them up on the desk one by one. 2 should have been short-term only. 1 had been renewed for years on parent report. Another had no clean reason to still be part of my regimen at all. 1 bottle had my name on it and dosage instructions that didn't match what my mother had actually been giving me. I stared at the labels until my vision blurred. "What happens now?" I asked. He answered gently. "Now we find out what your body feels like when it belongs to you." That line stayed with me. Not because it sounded pretty, because it sounded impossible. The first week was awful, not cinematic awful. Worse, real awful, shaky, angry, hungry at weird hours, tired in different ways. I stayed with my friend Nina because Dana said nobody should do a medication reset and a psychological unspooling in the same apartment where the lie was learned. Nina bought bland cereal, moved her work calls to the bedroom, and never once asked me why I kept standing in the kitchen like I was waiting for permission to open cupboards in my own life. My mother left 19 voicemails in the first 4 days. By the 5th, they changed shape, from outrage to grief, from grief to accusation, from accusation to pleading. Then one message landed in a tone I knew too well, cold, stripped, done performing. "If you keep this up," she said, "people are going to think I hurt you." I saved that one, because guilt speaks differently from fear of exposure, and I was finally learning the difference. By week 3, I was sleeping through the night. For the first time I could remember. By week 5, the swelling in my face had started to go down. By week 7, I walked around a grocery store alone and realized halfway through produce that I was not dizzy, not panicked, not waiting for a collapse my mother had trained me to expect like weather. I just bought oranges and cried in aisle 4 because freedom is sometimes that small when you get it late enough. The formal report did happen. I won't pretend otherwise. But the real consequence arrived long before paperwork did. It arrived the first time my mother sat in a room where nobody let her narrate me. It arrived the first time my body contradicted her. It arrived when I stopped sounding fragile and started sounding accurate. I do not speak to her now. That sentence used to feel impossible. Now it feels like a locked cabinet finally opening from the inside. Dr. Keller still treats me, carefully, slowly, like a physician who understands that medicine can become part of the trauma when it has been used as theater for too long. He never calls me brave. I'm grateful for that. Brave is another word people use when they want women to survive things without making anyone else uncomfortable. What he says instead is better. He says, "Your body is learning you." I think I am too. Hi everyone, thank you for being here. If this had happened to you, would you have made your mother leave the room that day? Or would you have frozen and let her keep talking? And after finding out your whole life had been shaped around an illness story that may never have been true, would you ever let that person back into your life? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to see you in the next one.